There's a city underwater, right off a coast you could walk on now. These ruins under the sea, they're not just random, they're clues. They tell us something about rising seas a long time ago. How people back then dealt with a planet that was changing. It gives you a different way to look at old myths, lost cities, the environmental forces that have always shaped where people live, what happens to them. There's the story of the Great Flood. Was that a real memory, a continent drowning, or ports, thriving ports, that just disappeared from the map, and the sea holds that story? A forgotten story about our own world too. A city can vanish under the water in two ways. One is fast, a violent event that's over in a day. The other is slow, a quiet surrender that takes generations. The ruins from each are different. They tell different stories, and to understand this mystery, you have to learn to read them. The evidence is in the stone. An earthquake can drop a coastline in an instant. The ruins are chaotic. Buildings are fractured, walls collapse, and then there are the columns, massive stone columns, all tilted at the same angle, all leaning the same way. Frozen the moment the ground gave way. That's the signature of a catastrophe. A single terrible day written into the land. But there's another kind of evidence. On a beach where the sea rose slowly, you find something else, not broken columns, foundations, the smooth stones of an old roadway just under the sand, visible when the tide pulls back. Archaeologists look for layers like pages in a book. They find a street, then a layer of silt, then another street built on top. That's the story of gradual change. A community fighting the water, raising their city bit by bit until they couldn't raise it anymore. This distinction changes everything. It changes how we see the people who lived there. A sudden disaster leaves no time. It's a story of loss, a culture cut short. A slow inundation is different. It's a story of resilience, generations making difficult choices. A long, reluctant retreat from a shoreline that kept advancing. So when we look at these sunken places, we have to ask first, what kind of ending was it? The answer shapes every question after that. Off the southern tip of Japan, the water is a deep blue. About 80 feet down on the seafloor, there's something that doesn't belong. It's called the Yonaguni Monument. From above, it looks like a giant staircase sunken. Massive flat terraces cut into the bedrock. They have sharp 90-degree angles, straight walls that go on for dozens of feet. There are wide platforms, there are pillars, there's a triangular opening like an archway. When you first see it, the thought is immediate. This was built. This isn't random, this isn't nature, but that's where the mystery starts, because the ocean is the greatest sculptor on Earth. Could currents over thousands of years have done this? The rock is sandstone. Sandstone erodes in layers. It can create flat surfaces. This debate has divided experts for decades. The ones who see a human hand point to the precision. The straight lines, the right angles, the symmetry, they point to features like carved steps or altars, some connected to the legend of Mu, a lost Pacific continent. The idea is tantalizing. What if this is a remnant, a sophisticated culture, built when sea levels were lower, then swallowed by the rising water at the end of the last ice age? That would rewrite our understanding. Ancient human movement in this part of the world, ancient capability, but science makes us pause. There's a psychological force. Pareidolia, our brain's tendency to see familiar patterns in random shapes, a face in the moon, a castle in a cloud. Could we be seeing a city in an eroded rock formation? Geologists argue for a natural origin. Tectonic activity can fracture stone in straight lines. Relentless ocean currents can smooth sandstone. They can undercut layers, creating those terraces. Those overhangs, the truth might be in between. Maybe it started as a natural formation, then was modified later by ancient people. a sacred site, a quarry. A place of ceremony, enhanced by human hands to accentuate what nature already made. Whether it's natural, partly shaped, or fully constructed, Yonaguni forces a question. If our eyes can be so easily tricked, how do we ever know for sure what we're looking at? It teaches a discipline, the discipline to interpret these silent ruins underwater. We have to separate our hope for discovery from the hard evidence, the evidence of the stones themselves, and sometimes the most important lesson is learning what we cannot yet prove. Off the coast of Gujarat in western India, there's a site linked to Dwarka, the fabled city of Lord Krishna. Ancient texts describe it, a city of prosperity, built on land reclaimed from the sea. And they describe its end. After Krishna left the world, the ocean rose. It swallowed Dwarka whole. For a long time, that was a sacred story, a metaphor. Then, in the late 20th century, marine archaeologists went into those waters. What they found wasn't a metaphor. Under the waves, they found massive stone structures. Large blocks, some weighed hundreds of kilograms, arranged in geometric patterns. They found stone anchors, the kind used by ancient ships, and pottery shards. Some over 3,000 years old. This wasn't random debris. This was evidence of an organized settlement, now submerged. The material evidence was real. And it was old, so the question became, how did it get there? Could this be the physical counterpart to the mythic Dwarka? Scholars are careful. They call it a settlement that aligns with the description. And the time frame of the legendary city, the connection is powerful. Even if the direct name is held in reverence, the scientific explanation offers a parallel. This period, roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, coincides with a phase of sea level rise, post-glacial. The great ice sheets had melted, but the oceans were still adjusting. Still creeping upward, a prosperous port city on a low-lying coast would have been vulnerable. Over generations, a slow, relentless advance, flooding foundations, contaminating wells, eroding the land itself. The community would have fought back, building walls, raising embankments, until the effort became impossible. A final, catastrophic storm surge could have been the last chapter. The event remembered as the sea consuming the city in a single, divine act. This fusion is where the mystery deepens. It suggests cultural memory can be a vessel for geological truth. The story of Dwarka's drowning, passed down through generations in verse and ritual, may preserve the experience of a civilization confronting a changing shoreline. The myth isn't just a tale, it's a record. It encodes the trauma of loss, the memory of a prosperous place taken by the water. When material evidence from the seafloor aligns with such a persistent narrative, you have to listen to these ancient stories differently. They aren't merely allegories, they are often rooted in a shared, lived reality, a reality of rising seas that our ancestors witnessed and endured. And never forgot, Pavlopetri sits in about 10 feet of water. The water is so clear you can see everything from a boat. It's not a monument, it's a whole city. A Bronze Age town, and its layout is perfectly preserved. It's like the sea just laid a sheet of glass over it. You can follow the main road. You can make out courtyards, homes. There are tombs, what look like public buildings. It's a complete urban snapshot, frozen around 5,000 years ago. The preservation is so intact, it feels less like a dig site and more like a moment. A day in a coastal community just suspended. The story here isn't about violent destruction, it's about quiet depth. A tsunami or an earthquake would have shattered that orderly grid. Walls would be toppled, stones scattered. Pavlopetri shows none of that. The buildings aren't collapsed, they're just submerged. The artifacts they found, pottery, tools, they weren't smashed in some sudden event. They seem to have been left behind or slowly covered by silt. That points to a different ending, a gradual one. The science of sea level rise gives us the timeline. After the last ice age, the oceans were climbing, a global process, slow but relentless. For a city built on a low, sandy shore, the advance would have been inches per year. Maybe a foot per generation. At first, it was probably manageable. A seasonal flood happens more often. A well near the shore turns salty. The community likely adapted. Raised floors built small barriers, but the water has a patience humans don't. Eventually, the cost of staying would have outweighed the benefit. Salt would poison the gardens. Storms would reach further inland. The decision to leave wouldn't have been made in a panic. It would have been a slow, grim consensus. They packed what they could carry from their homes. Moved to higher ground, watched from a distance as the sea claimed their ancestors' streets. That makes Pavlopetri a unique laboratory. Because it was submerged gently, it preserves the ordinary. We see how people organized their space, where they lived, where they worked, where they honored their past. It offers direct evidence of how a prehistoric community functioned. And how its world literally slipped away from beneath it. There's no need for myth here. The city itself is the record. Its silent, sunken streets are a direct map of Antiquity's changing shoreline. A physical testament to the long retreat that has defined human history along every coast. When we look at Pavlopetri, we're not looking for a legendary catastrophe. We're witnessing the slow, undeniable force of a rising sea, and the quiet resilience of those who chose to walk away from its advance. There was a city built to defy the sea, to show mastery over it. That story is at Caesarea Maritima, on the coast of what's now Israel. King Herod the Great wanted a statement. In the 1st century before the Common Era, he ordered a harbor city built from nothing. An artificial port out into the open Mediterranean. It was called Sebastos, a wonder of the ancient world. They used a revolutionary concrete that could set underwater. They sank enormous stone blocks, some over 50 tons, to form breakwaters stretching far out to sea. It created a safe anchorage where nature had provided none. The ultimate symbol of Roman power, a declaration that the sea could be tamed, and for a time it worked. Caesarea became a bustling hub, but today much of that harbor is ruins beneath the waves. Its broken foundations are a maze for divers. The question is what happened. Its decline is complex. Historical records mention earthquakes which damaged the structures. Silt from rivers filled parts of the basin, but researchers looking at the ruins have identified another, slower actor, a combination of gradual tectonic subsidence, the land sinking, and the creeping rise of sea levels over centuries. Imagine those breakwaters. They were designed for a specific sea level. As the water climbed, inch by inch, it eventually overtopped them. Wave action became more powerful, striking at new, vulnerable points. The concrete itself began to fail under a sustained assault it was never meant to endure. This changes how we see the fall. It wasn't just a single catastrophe. It was a slow unraveling. A series of environmental pressures chipping away at human ambition over hundreds of years. The empire that built it was long gone by the time the sea made its final claim. Caesarea Maritima shows coastal vulnerability is a long game. The most advanced engineering of its day couldn't hold back the incremental force of a changing planet. Even the mightiest constructions, symbols of control, are in a silent dialogue with the sea. And time is always on the sea's side. North of Bimini, the water gets shallow. It's clear, so clear you can see straight to the bottom, and on that sandy bottom there's this pathway, a line of huge rectangular blocks. They look fitted like paving stones, like a wall that's fallen over. It runs for almost half a mile. From above, the pattern looks deliberate. It looks made. That's the Bimini Road, and for a long time people have pointed to it. Called it evidence for a lost civilization, for something like Atlantis. The idea pulls you in. Could this be a sunken highway, a piece of a drowned world? There's a powerful desire there to see a builder's hand in nature's chaos. It feels like a discovery, but then you look closer. you listen to what the stones actually are. Geologists have studied them. The blocks are beak rock. It's a limestone. It forms naturally right in the tidal zone. Sand and shell fragments. They cement together over centuries. And as they form, they often fracture. They break along straight lines. That creates these blocks that look cut. The parallel rows. Natural processes can do that. Sedimentation, cracking. The consensus is it's natural. It's a remarkable formation, but it's natural. But to just dismiss it, that misses something. Maybe the real significance isn't about who shaped it, it's about where it sits. The Bimini Road is in about 15 feet of water. That fact is the key. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower, hundreds of feet lower. This whole area was dry land. What's now seafloor was a coastal plain, maybe a beach. That's where those stones first formed. The flooding of this place, it wasn't a mythic catastrophe. It was geologic, it was certain. The ice melted, the water rose. And this feature, along with huge stretches of land, was slowly submerged. So the road challenges you in two ways. First, it asks you to separate hope from evidence. To accept a natural story when it fits. But second, and more important, it stands as a marker. A permanent marker of a changed world. Its location under the waves is proof. Proof of an ancient geography that's gone. It shows you something. The very features that make you imagine lost cities, they're often the direct evidence of the rising seas. The seas that would have consumed any city built there. The Bimini Road might not be a road to Atlantis, but it is a signpost. It points to a time when the Earth looked different. When the shoreline was somewhere else, a shoreline that's now just a memory under the sea. The stones only give you part of it. To really see it, you have to look at the water. The ocean has a memory. It keeps a kind of diary, not with words but in layers of mud and in the chemistry of coral. Reading that diary, that's Paleoceanography. It's asking the sea for its own history, and the tools for that, they're elegant. They show you things. Take the seafloor. It's not blank. Over thousands of years, sediment builds up. Fine particles settling down year after year. Scientists can pull up a core sample, a long cylinder of that layered mud. Each layer is like a page, and in those layers there are tiny shells. From microscopic creatures, foraminifera, the chemistry in those shells, it holds a secret. It records the temperature of the water where they lived. It records the size of the ice sheets globally. By analyzing the isotopes in the shells, researchers can rebuild ancient climates. They can see when the ice was growing. And when it was melting away, then there are the coral terraces. Corals are like living clocks. They only grow in shallow, sunlit water. So if you find an ancient coral reef, but it's deep underwater now, that means the sea level was once low enough for it to live there. And if you find a series of these reefs stacked like stairs, you're looking at a record of the sea rising. Each step is a pause, a period of stability before the water climbed again. These proxies together, they paint a graph of planetary change, and what they show isn't a smooth, gentle rise. It's a story of fits and starts, long periods where things held steady. And then dramatic meltwater pulses, events where massive amounts of ice would collapse into the oceans, causing sea levels to jump several feet in just a few centuries. That scientific backbone, it changes everything for the sunken ruins. A place like Pavlopetri, it stops being an isolated mystery. It becomes a data point on that global graph. The timing of its submergence, it lines up precisely with one of these known periods of post-glacial rise. So the story its silent streets tell, that's not just local folklore anymore. It's not guesswork, it has empirical weight. The physical evidence on the seafloor and the chemical evidence in the sediment cores, they're telling the same story. They confirm that the people in that coastal town, they were living through a chapter of a much larger planetary narrative. Their experience wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a local expression of a global process. When you link the drowned city to the ocean's own diary, the past comes into focus, a sharper focus. You see that these communities were witnesses. And they were participants in a changing world. Their choices, their adaptations, their retreats, those were all responses to forces that were written into the very chemistry of the sea. 20,000 years ago, the map was completely different. The planet was locked in the last glacial maximum. So much water was frozen into these massive ice sheets, miles deep, that the ocean level was over 120 meters lower. That's taller than a 30-story building. The coastlines were far out, hundreds of kilometers from where they are now. The floor of the North Sea was a cold plain. They called it Doggerland. It connected Britain to Europe. In the Pacific, islands we see as separate were part of bigger landmasses. And up north, the lower sea exposed a wide bridge of tundra between Asia and North America. Beringia, that's the corridor the first people used to enter a new continent. That was the stage. The shorelines pulled back, revealing a geography we only know as seabed. And on those exposed shelves, on those new plains, people lived, they hunted, they built communities. Many of the sites we find underwater now, from the North Sea to India and Japan, weren't coastal then. They were inland, they were on stable ground, near rivers that flowed across landscapes that are now drowned. That ancient geography is the first page. It changes everything that came after, because what followed wasn't a sudden, mythic flood. It was a return, a process over millennia of the ice melting and the water coming back. As the glaciers retreated, the seas rose. They didn't jump up all at once. They advanced century after century, a slow, inexorable flood. The world those first settlers knew was gradually taken back. The land bridges vanished. Doggerland went under the waves. The continental shelves flooded, turning hills into islands and valleys into bays. It was a great, global reshaping of where people could live. A relentless force that every coastal culture, everywhere, would have faced. Their stories of great floods weren't inventions. They were heirlooms, memories of a lost world, passed down for hundreds of generations. A world that began for them not at the water's edge but far beyond it. That slow rise had these moments of real speed. Around 14,500 years ago, something dramatic happened. A huge amount of ice, probably from Antarctica or the big northern sheets, it became unstable. It collapsed. It wasn't a slow melt. It was a catastrophic release. A flood of fresh water into the oceans. That event is called Meltwater Pulse 1A. The scale is hard to understand. Sea level went up about 20 meters. That's over 60 feet, and it happened in about 500 years. That's not a geological time, that's a human one. Dozens of generations in a row would have seen it. For people on any coast, the shoreline didn't creep, it ran. A village built safely back from the water within one elder's lifetime would see the sea at its door. In a few more generations, it would be underwater. Salt water pushing in, poisoning the springs and rivers they needed. The hunting grounds, the sacred places, the burial sites, all of it swallowed. This wasn't a slow retreat. It was a rapid conquest, the ocean taking over. The psychological impact, it had to be profound. The world they knew, the very geography of their lives, was being rewritten. Every year, the high tide was further in. Every storm did more damage. What they knew about safe harbors became useless. The memory of good fishing grounds became a story about a place that was gone. For early coastal settlements, this was an existential crisis. It forced a complete adaptation. They had to move, not just once, but again and again. Always looking for higher ground, they had to leave behind not just homes, but the whole cultural landscape. The places for stories, for ceremonies, for burying the dead, all left to the waves. That experience, that shared trauma of a drowning world, it would have been seared into memory. It would have been the defining event, and this is where science and story come together. This period, Meltwater Pulse 1A, It lines up with a time when human cultures were getting more complex, more able to preserve stories across generations. So it makes sense that cultures everywhere, from Mesopotamia to the Americas, from China to the Pacific Islands, they all have a core story, a story about a great flood. Sent by higher powers, a few survivors, a world remade. The details are different, the characters change, but the central cataclysm is the same. These aren't just coincidences. They're not borrowed tales, they're likely independent echoes of the same global event. They're the cultural fossils of Meltwater Pulse 1A. When the ocean rose up and reshaped the human world, it didn't just drown coastlines. It gave birth to some of our oldest stories, stories that remembered when the water won. The map of Europe, you know, is missing something. A whole continent is gone. Not a separate landmass, but a huge, low plain that connected Britain to Denmark, to Germany, to the Netherlands. That place is called Doggerland now. For thousands of years, it was a heartland. It was home, a sprawling, fertile place, rolling hills, forests, rivers, marshes, full of life. Mammoths and reindeer grazed there. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers followed the seasons. They made camps along the lake shores. They left their tools there, their hearths, their stories in the soil. And then the sea took it back. Doggerland is the most dramatic example. That world reshaping itself after the ice. Its loss wasn't one event, it was a process. With a final, terrible mark, for centuries the land itself was rising, rebounding from the weight of the glaciers, but the global sea level was rising faster. So the shoreline advanced slowly. Salt water crept into the freshwater marshes. The forests died, their roots poisoned by the sea. The great hunting grounds shrank. Season by season, communities were pushed west toward the hills that would become Britain, or east toward the European mainland. It was a long retreat. A grinding retreat from a drowning world. Then, around 8,150 years ago, the catastrophe. Off the coast of Norway, a massive underwater landslide. The Storegga slide, it triggered a tsunami. A wall of water raced across the North Sea. When it reached the last low stretches of Doggerland, it was devastating. The wave swept across the final islands, the final wetlands. It scoured the landscape, drowned any life that was left. That event was the end. It cut the physical connection between Britain and the continent. A continuous cultural landscape became separated by open water. We know this story from the seafloor, not from myths. Modern seismic survey data, the kind used to search for oil, has mapped the drowned land. It shows the ghost of a landscape, the ancient river valleys, the hills, the old coastlines, and then there are the artifacts, pulled up for over a century by North Sea fishermen. Stone tools, finely crafted points made of bone and antler, the kind used for hunting and fishing. These aren't things lost from a boat, they're possessions. Belonging to people who lived on dry land, a land that's now 60 to 100 feet underwater. Doggerland forces a recalibration. This wasn't a city sinking. It wasn't a port, this was an entire country, an ecosystem, a human territory erased from the map. Its disappearance triggered massive migrations, forced migrations. It reshaped the genetic and cultural landscape of prehistoric Europe profoundly. The people who fled its shores carried their memories with them, their technologies. Their trauma, they went to new lands, they became ancestors of new communities who maybe told stories, stories of a fertile plain lost to a hungry sea. In Doggerland, you see the ultimate consequence of rising water, not just the submergence of a site, the complete annihilation of a world and the birth of a new geographic reality. One that still defines Europe today. That long retreat wasn't always silent. It wasn't just about leaving. In many places, it was about staying, and to stay, you had to fight. You had to build. The evidence from these old coastlines isn't just about loss. It's also a record of ingenuity, a testament to the drive to adapt, to reshape the world instead of being reshaped by it. You see this in the choices of where to build and how. Take the Lapita people. They were the great voyagers of the Pacific, spreading across islands thousands of years ago. They settled on low-lying atolls on coastal plains. They faced constant vulnerability. Their solution was to build up. Archaeologists find their settlements not on the flat ground but on mounds. Artificial mounds, they raised their homes, their meeting places above the flood zone. These weren't just piles of dirt, they were engineered platforms. Built up over generations with coral rubble, shell, and earth, they created their own high ground, a deliberate communal effort to gain a few more precious feet of elevation against the tides. Against the storms, it was a slow, persistent form of defiance. This same logic of elevation appears inland in the great river valleys, the cities of Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley. They weren't battling the open ocean, but they faced a related threat: unpredictable river floods, seasonal inundations that could wipe out a harvest, erase a neighborhood. Their response was also to build up. The great ziggurats, those temple mounds, had spiritual meaning, but their foundations were practical. They were artificial mountains in a flat landscape. Places of refuge when the waters rose. The entire urban plan reflected this. Cities were built on massive platforms, or they were built on high tells. These are the accumulated layers of centuries of rebuilding, each new generation constructing on the rubble of the last, gradually lifting the entire city higher. It was a form of vertical migration, a community climbing upward, story by story, to escape the water below. Then there's the more direct approach, the wall. The sea wall, we have hints of this from some coastal ruins. At sites now underwater, archaeologists sometimes find lines of large boulders, or the remains of what look like revetments. Structures designed to break the force of waves, to hold the shoreline in place. These are harder to identify. The sea eventually claims them too, but their possible existence speaks to a bold idea. The idea that you could draw a line in the sand, tell the ocean it could not cross. It's the same impulse that led to grand harbors, but on a smaller scale. A community pooling its labor, piling stone upon stone, creating a fragile barrier between their world and the advancing sea. When you look at a sunken ruin through this lens, its meaning changes. The fact that it's underwater is no longer just an ending. It becomes the final chapter in a long story of adaptation. You have to ask new questions. Are those foundation stones part of a raised platform? Was this city once higher than the land around it? Does the layout suggest it was designed for drainage, for managing water? These clues transform a site from a passive victim of the sea into an active participant in a struggle. Each raised mound, each retaining wall, represents a decision. A vote for persistence. They are physical proof of a dialogue, a conversation between a community and its environment. The sea proposes a challenge: rising water, stronger storms. And humanity responds with earth, with stone, with design. For a time, the response works. The community holds, but the dialogue never really ends. The sea always gets the last word. It just might take centuries to say it. The sea is one part of it, but the ground itself is moving. To know why a ruin sits at a certain depth, you have to listen to the local geology. Sea level change is a global signal, but it plays out on a stage that's shifting. In some places, that stage is sinking. Tectonic subsidence. It's this slow, relentless downward creep of the land. And it can amplify rising water. It's a 1-2 punch. The ocean climbs globally and the land falls locally. The coastline can retreat with startling speed. So the depth of a sunken city is rarely a simple gauge of past sea level. It's a puzzle, a record of planetary climate and local geology. You see this on the volcanic coast of Italy near Naples. Bay is there. In Roman times, it was a luxury resort for emperors, senators, stunning villas, thermal baths built around volcanic springs. Today, much of it is underwater. But it didn't sink from a sudden cataclysm. It was claimed by bradisism, a phenomenon linked to the volcanic activity. Magma chambers deep below inflate and deflate over time. The ground above rises and falls with agonizing slowness. In that area, the trend has been a long, gradual subsidence. The land has been sinking for 2,000 years. So the Mediterranean Sea has risen modestly, but the local drop of the land has been the dominant force. The marble floors of bays' villas are beneath the bay now. Visited by fish, not senators, its depth tells a story specific to that coastline, written in magma and stone. Now compare that to a more stable coast. The ruins off the shore of Atlat Yam in Israel, a Neolithic village, older than the pyramids sitting on the seafloor. There, the tectonic plate is quiet. The land itself hasn't sunk much, so the primary reason Atlat Yam is underwater is the genuine, post-glacial rise of the Mediterranean. Its depth is a purer reflection of that global process. Putting Bayi and Atlat Yam side by side, they might be at similar depths, but they arrived there for different reasons. One is a story of a restless earth. The other is a story of a filling ocean. This complexity is the rule. Across the Pacific Ring of Fire, from Japan to Alaska to Chile, tectonic activity is constant. Earthquakes can cause instant, catastrophic subsidence. A fault line slips and a stretch of coastline drops several feet in seconds. The sea rushes in. That isn't a change in the water volume. It's a change in the bathtub shape. The long-term sinking of a tectonic plate can have the same effect over centuries. Slowly drowning a shoreline. For archaeologists, every submerged site requires a forensic disentanglement. They have to ask how much is due to the water rising and how much is due to the land falling. They look for geological benchmarks, ancient shorelines etched into cliff faces, fossilized coral reefs that grew at sea level. These act as fixed points. They let scientists separate the local movement of the land from the global movement of the sea. Only when these factors are pulled apart can the true history be read. The depth of a ruin becomes not just a measurement but a language. It speaks of ice ages ending, of continents in slow motion. It tells us the past wasn't a static map. It was a dynamic, breathing landscape, where the very ground could be an ally or a betrayer in humanity's long conversation with the sea. You remember a world that's gone by telling a story. And the oldest stories we have all over the world are often about water. A great flood, the Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia describes it. A god warns a man, Utnapishtim, to build a boat. To save his family and the animals, the rains come, the waters rise, and the world drowns. It sounds familiar. The story of Noah in the Hebrew Bible follows almost the same path. But it's not just there. The Greeks had Deucalion, a flood sent by Zeus. The Maya have a myth about a deluge that ended an earlier age of humanity. The indigenous peoples of Australia, the cultures of China, of India, they all keep a story of a catastrophic flood. The parallels are too many, too deep to just be coincidence. Scholars call it the flood myth motif. For a long time, it was treated as pure allegory. A story about divine punishment or moral cleansing. But what if it's something else too? What if it's a memory? That's the hypothesis, that these stories are cultural fossils of a real shared experience. The experience of rapid change at the end of the last ice age. Meltwater Pulse 1 was a global event. Its effects would have touched every coastline. But most people wouldn't have seen a rising ocean as one slow process. They would have lived it as a series of local disasters, a terrible storm surge breaking a barrier, a tsunami from a distant quake, salt poisoning a freshwater spring, the relentless erosion of a sacred headland over a lifetime, each event a trauma. Each one a story, and in the telling, over generations the specifics fade. The storm becomes divine wrath. the elder who urged moving to higher ground becomes a prophet. The canoe that saved a family becomes a great ark. The local flood merges with stories from neighboring tribes, traded along ancient routes until it becomes a myth of a world-ending deluge. It becomes archetypal. Losing land has a profound psychological impact. It's not just losing a home, it's losing geography, the map of your life, the places you learned to fish, where you courted your partner, where your ancestors are buried. When that map is erased by the sea, it creates a rupture, a before and an after. Storytelling becomes the tool to bridge that rupture, to make sense of the loss. To warn future generations, to say the world can change in ways we can't control. The story encodes the trauma, but it also encodes survival. It says we endured this. We remembered, and because we remembered, we carried on. This connection changes how you listen to these ancient texts. They're not just spiritual guides or simple fables. They're potential reservoirs of paleo-environmental data. When a myth describes waters rising to mountaintops, it might echo the experience of people on a low coastal plain, watching the hills they once saw from a distance become islands and then vanish. When a story describes floodwaters receding to reveal a new world, it might remember the aftermath. The staggering sight of a familiar landscape utterly transformed, scoured clean, ready for a new beginning, linking the physical ruins on the seafloor to these intangible stories creates a fuller picture. The stones of Pavlopetri show the where and the how. The myth of a great flood told from the Mediterranean to the Pacific shows the why people never forgot. It suggests the most powerful human responses to catastrophe aren't always written in stone. Sometimes they're carried on the breath, in stories told around a fire, generation after generation. A warning and a testament that the sea has a long memory, and so do we. A harbor isn't just a dock, it's a living part of a civilization, a point where goods and ideas and people all come together. So when a port sinks, the damage isn't local. It's a rupture in a network. The shockwaves travel inland and across the sea. You can see it in Alexandria's ancient harbor. The Pharaoh's lighthouse once guided ships from everywhere. Its ruins are underwater now. The island of Antirodos with its palaces is down there. That's more than a drowned neighborhood. It marks a slow strangulation. The harbor silted up, parts of it sank, its capacity dwindled, the deepest berths became unusable, larger ships couldn't get in. The cost of trade went up, shipments became less reliable, and gradually the economic gravity shifted. Other ports with deeper water began to pull that traffic away. The city remained, but its dominance as the main crossroads started to fade. It wasn't destroyed in a day, it was outcompeted by geography. A similar story happened with the Roman port of Luna in Italy. It was a hub for marble and goods. Its harbor succumbed to silt, the shoreline changed, the settlement was abandoned. The trade routes that used it had to find new paths. New ports emerged. This rerouting of commerce had consequences. Wealth flows along these channels. When a channel is blocked, the wealth finds a new path. Cities on the periphery can become central. Empires that relied on a port for taxes or supplies faced a crisis. The loss of a key harbor could force a realignment of entire systems. But the loss is more than economic. Ports are cultural synapses, where languages mix, where religions are introduced, where new technologies are first seen. A sunken port doesn't just erase warehouses, it dissolves a forum for human exchange. The flow of ideas is interrupted. The potential for fusion in that specific place at that time is lost. The ruins on the seafloor aren't just markers of where water met land. They're markers of historical turning points, moments where environmental change, a sinking coast, a rising sea steered the course of human development. It decided which cities would thrive as capitals of commerce and which would become backwaters. It influenced which cultures had easy access to the wider world's ideas. and which became more isolated. When we look at these silent harbors, we're looking at the ghost of a possible future, a future where trade and ideas kept flowing through that gateway. Its absence changed what came next. The sea didn't just claim stones, it redirected the current of history. These stories about flooded ports and trade routes, they're really about people. People who had to leave. We call them climate refugees now. It sounds like a modern idea, but it's ancient. Every settlement that went underwater, from Doggerland to Pavlopetri, it created refugees. The first climate refugees, people, whole communities watching their world dissolve under them. You see traces of their journeys in the archaeology. Not in big monuments, but in small things. A style of pottery shows up somewhere new, far from where it started. The design is the same, but the clay is local. That's a sign of migration. People arrived with their knowledge, but they adapted. They used what they found, or scientists look at genetic lines. They find a population shrinks, then suddenly expands into a new area. And it lines up with a time we know the coasts were flooding. Those are the quiet footprints of people on the move. Anthropology gives us a window into this. By looking at coastal communities today, facing erosion and rising seas, we can guess at the old struggles. The loss isn't just things, it's the burial grove for generations now gone. It's the fishing spot only your grandfather knew, its location lost under the new sea, that cuts a living tie to ancestry and place. It creates a deep grief. A loss of who you are, and when these displaced groups reached new lands, those lands weren't empty, others were already there. That brought huge social pressure. Competition for water, for good soil, for hunting grounds. It could lead to conflict, to violence, but it could also lead to new things, to exchange. To different social structures made out of need. The refugees brought new ideas, new tools. Sometimes they brought a desperate resilience that helped everyone survive. This human view changes the scale. The slow creep of the ocean becomes a personal timeline. A child is born in a house by the shore. As a young adult, they help build a wall against the tides. In middle age, they decide to move the family inland. In old age, they tell their grandchildren about the old village by the water, a place those kids have never seen. That's the real drama of the ancient rising seas. It was lived across human lifetimes. It forced a choice between holding on and letting go. It tested community bonds and redrew the map of human relations. The sunken ruins aren't just geological curiosities. They were the homes of countless people facing a changing world. Their legacy is in the cultures they joined, the conflicts they lived through, and the simple, enduring act of survival that let their stories, in some form, finally reach us. The coral remembers. In tropical waters, a reef is a living record, a kind of stone journal. It's written in the pattern of its growth. Corals are very specific about their conditions. They need sunlight, clear water, a certain depth. They can't be too deep or too exposed, so a reef, just by being there, marks the sea level of its era. It grows up toward the light. It follows the water's surface as it climbs. If the sea is stable, the reef grows wide. If the sea rises, the reef climbs fast, building vertically. And when you find an old fossil reef, deep underwater or up on land, you've found a fossil shoreline, a marker of where the ocean used to be. To read it, scientists do a sort of underwater archaeology. They take cores. A hollow drill cuts down through the old coral. What comes up is a stone cylinder, a timeline. Each band is a year of growth, like a tree ring. The chemistry of those bands gives the exact age, and by measuring its depth compared to now, they can calculate how high or low the ocean was back then. The clearest record comes from Barbados. Off its coast, there's a series of fossil reefs. They're stacked like steps. Each step is a reef from a time when sea level was stable. The risers between them are when the sea rose fast, forcing the coral upward. By dating each of these massive steps, scientists built a precise calendar. A graph of global sea level change over 20,000 years. The Barbados data is so clear, it's the gold standard, the benchmark. And if you lay that coral graph over the timeline of sunken ruins, the stories align. The slow drowning of a place like Pavlopetri fits a period of steady rise on the coral record. The rapid flooding that might inspire flood myths matches the steep lines on the graph, the meltwater pulses. Submerged Roman ports sit right where the coral says the sea had reached by then. That's not coincidence, it's corroboration. The silent stones on the seafloor and the silent stone of the coral are telling the same story in two different languages. One is human, the other is planetary. The coral gives the impartial, global framework. It shows that what happened to those coastal towns wasn't isolated. They were local chapters in a planetary event, a shared reality of a rising ocean. When evidence from opposite sides of the globe converges like this, the past comes into sharp focus. We're not just interpreting ruins or myths, we're reading the Earth's own memoir. Stone and pottery, they can last for millennia underwater, but the sea, it holds more than just the hard things. It holds moments. In the mud of a harbor, the oxygen-poor mud, wood doesn't rot, leather straps survive, woven baskets, even food, perfectly preserved for thousands of years. It's a time capsule of the everyday, a wooden comb left on a shelf, a fishing boat hull with its net still there. These intimate details, land archaeology rarely finds them. The seafloor, in the right conditions, becomes a museum of the mundane. And the mundane, that's the true story. But this preservation, it's a fragile bargain. The same water that protects, it also destroys. Exposed stone gets scoured by currents and sand. It gets encrusted. Barnacles, mollusks, a process called biofouling, and it slowly eats the surface away. A storm can shift tons of sand in one night. It can bury a site or expose it to new erosion. The environment is dynamic, it's powerful, unforgiving. So every dive, every survey becomes a race against time, against the elements. Marine archaeologists aren't just historians, they're underwater detectives. And the crime scene is actively being tampered with. To solve this, they use tools that let them see without touching. Side-scan sonar paints an acoustic picture of the seafloor. It reveals shapes, walls under silt, outlines of streets. Magnetometers detect buried metal, tools, nails, but the real revolution is photogrammetry. Divers take thousands of overlapping photos from every angle. Software stitches these into a precise 3D model, a digital replica. It lets researchers study every stone, measure every angle, simulate water flow, all from a computer on dry land, and it minimizes disturbance to the fragile site itself. The sunken city of Baiae, off Italy, shows what this can reveal. Volcanic sediments buried it, and they protected it. The mosaic floors in its villas are still vibrant. Statues stand in silent hallways. The layout of its baths, its gardens, is perfectly clear. This isn't just a ruin, it's a snapshot, opulent Roman leisure frozen in time. It tells us about engineering, about art, about social life, with a clarity that land sites rebuilt over centuries often can't match. Yet for every Baiae, there are a dozen sites where the story is fragmentary. A coastal settlement on sandy soil might leave almost no trace, its wooden structures long dissolved. A site in a turbulent channel, its artifacts scattered by currents, just a confusing jumble left behind. The historical narrative we recover is shaped by these conditions. Shaped by loss, we know the Romans built grand harbors because they built them in stone. We know less about the seafaring cultures before them. They may have used mostly wood and fiber. Their legacy is largely silent, erased by the very sea they sailed. This creates a bias. The past we can see is the past made of durable things, in places the sea chose to keep. So we have to listen carefully to these silent stones, but also acknowledge the louder silence. the silence of what is gone. Every well-preserved floor, every intact amphora is a gift. A gift from a capricious environment, and every empty stretch of seafloor might hold a story we will never fully hear. Plato's story of Atlantis is the most famous lost city. He wrote about it in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. That was around 360 years before the Common Era. He described a powerful island nation. Advanced, a utopia that grew arrogant, a civilization that sank into the sea in a single day and night. For centuries that's been a siren call, a map to a hidden treasure. But to understand it, you have to read it as Plato intended, not as history, as a philosophical parable, a story about the corruption of power, about how even the greatest societies are fragile. The sinking was a metaphor, a moral lesson, not a geological report, but compelling stories often have a seed of truth. Could that be a real memory? Many scholars point to the eruption of Thera, a volcanic island in the Aegean. That was around the 16th century before the Common Era. It devastated the Minoan civilization on Crete. It would have generated massive tsunamis. It would have darkened the skies. To anyone living through it, it would have felt like the end of the world. The timing is too early for Plato, but the cultural memory of such an event could have echoed down through centuries. Blurring into legend, there's another possibility. The story may not be about one specific place. It could be a distilled memory of a recurring experience. The experience of coastal lands succumbing to the sea. We've seen this was a global reality for prehistoric communities. The slow loss of a fertile plain like Doggerland, or rapid flooding from a meltwater pulse, either could create a powerful narrative archetype, a story of a golden land now gone. Plato, crafting his allegory, might have drawn from that deep well of cultural memory. A memory of lands that literally vanished. This distinction is crucial. It separates the quest for a physical Atlantis, a lost continent with advanced technology, from the archaeological reality we find on the seafloor. We don't find evidence of a single, sophisticated super-civilization from 12,000 years ago. We find something perhaps more profound. We find many settlements. From different times, different cultures, all sharing the same fate. Pavlopetri, Dwarka, the villages now under the North Sea, they were not utopias. They were ordinary communities, fishermen, farmers, traders. Their stories aren't about hubris and divine punishment. They're about adaptation, resilience in the face of environmental change. The enduring power of the Atlantis myth tells us less about the past and more about ourselves. It speaks to a deep human fascination with lost worlds, with the idea that greatness was once achieved and then tragically lost. It's a romantic notion. It can inspire wonderful exploration, but it also carries a caution. The caution is about projection, about seeing what we want to see in the ambiguous evidence of the deep. When we look at a natural formation like the Bimini Road and insist it's a highway to Atlantis, we risk overlooking the true story. The story of a coastline that drowned not from mythic anger but from the steady, global rise of the sea. Atlantis, in the end, is a mirror. It reflects our longing for mystery, our desire for a grand, singular explanation. The scientific reality is more distributed, more gradual, and in many ways more relatable. It is the story of countless communities, not one legendary kingdom, learning the same hard lesson written along every shore. That the line between land and sea is never truly permanent, and that the greatest tales are often born from the simplest truths of human experience. The pollen tells a story the stones can't. You find it in the mud layers near a sunken settlement, more than pottery, microscopic grains of pollen preserved for thousands of years. Each grain is a time capsule, and by identifying the plants they came from, you can rebuild the landscape. You can see if it was oak forest or open grassland or fields of wheat and barley. That botanical snapshot shows how people lived off the land, and then it shows when that landscape changed, a shift from tree pollen to marsh grass. That's the wetlands moving in. Salt-tolerant plant spores appearing where freshwater species used to be. That's the fingerprint of the sea. That's palynology, reading the environment from specks of dust. But to understand why the environment changed, you have to look up to the ice. In Greenland, in Antarctica, they drill deep, they extract ice cores. Archives of the ancient atmosphere. Trapped inside are tiny air bubbles from thousands of years ago. The chemistry of that air, the ratio of oxygen isotopes, acts as a global thermometer. It records the planet's temperature when the snow fell, and by counting the annual layers, they can date these temperature shifts precisely. This data from the poles gives you the grand backdrop. The global climate context. It tells you when the world was warming, when the ice sheets were melting, pouring water into the oceans. Now bring these threads together. Take a sunken village in the North Sea. You have the local story from the pollen. It shows a freshwater marsh dying, replaced by salt water, and you have the global story from the ice cores. It shows a period of rapid warming, a meltwater pulse happening at the exact same time. The local event isn't an isolated mystery anymore. It's a direct consequence. The village drowned because the world warmed. That's the power of synthesis. It's a conversation between fields. The archaeologist has a stone tool from the drowned village. The geologist dates the layer. The palynologist describes the forest the tool maker lived in. The climatologist explains the global forces that drowned that forest. No single expert has the whole truth. The truth is in the connection. A lone ruin is a question mark, but you connect it to pollen data, ice core records, sea level curves from fossil coral. Even echoes in ancient myths, that question mark starts to form an answer. The story that comes out is rich, multidimensional. It shows human history not as a separate narrative, but as a strand woven into a much larger fabric. Earth's history, our ancestors' fortunes were tied to the climate in ways they couldn't have understood. Their migrations, their innovations, their tragedies. Often responses to planetary shifts, written in ice and sea. So when you see an image of a structure beneath the waves, remember, it's not just an archaeological site. It's a node in a vast network of data, a single point of light in a constellation of evidence, stretching from the ocean floor to the polar ice caps. Its true meaning is unlocked only when you listen to all the voices. The stones speak of a people, the pollen speaks of their home, the ice speaks of their world. And together they tell a story of change, a story we're only now learning to hear. The past shows us ourselves, those old communities watching their shorelines change. They were part of a planetary shift. We're part of one now. The scale is different, the pace is much faster, but the basic challenge is the same. A climate that's changing redraws the map between land and water. Those ruins aren't just relics, they're case studies. They give us a long-term view on a problem that feels completely modern. They show that the choice, holding on or letting go, is one of our oldest dilemmas. Look at the adaptations in the record, the raised mounds in the Pacific, the elevated platforms in Mesopotamian cities, the sea walls we find traces of. These were local fixes, incremental. They bought time, sometimes centuries. That's the first lesson. Adaptation isn't a single act, it's a continuous process. It needs constant watching, innovation, community effort. For us, that means building with flexibility, infrastructure that can be modified as things change. Protecting natural buffers, wetlands, mangroves, things ancient peoples might have just relied on. The goal isn't a permanent wall against the ocean, it's creating systems that can evolve with it. But the record also shows the limits. There's a point where the cost of staying is too high, where the energy to fight the water outweighs the land's value. We see that in the final abandonment of places like Pavlopetri. That moment of decision, collective decision, is maybe the hardest lesson. It means acknowledging loss. It means planning for managed retreat, a strategic, dignified movement of people and assets away from danger. That's not defeat, it's pragmatic resilience. It's what the survivors of Doggerland did, generation after generation, carrying their culture to new ground. For modern planning, it means having honest conversations. About risk, about property, about keeping community bonds even when the place itself has to change. Then there's how societies respond. Do environmental pressures cause collapse or transformation? The sunken cities show both. A sudden catastrophe could shatter a culture, leave nothing but broken stone, but a slower pressure often led to migration. Innovation, cultural fusion. The refugees from drowning coasts didn't vanish. They joined other groups, they brought new ideas, they sparked change, which suggests the ultimate impact of climate stress depends less on the stress itself and more on the social structures there to absorb it. Societies that are flexible, cooperative, equitable, they're far more likely to navigate a crisis than ones that are rigid and divided. Looking at our current crisis through this long lens, it clarifies things. It removes the illusion that we're unique. We're not the first generation to face a shifting world. That realization doesn't minimize our situation. If anything, it underscores it. The forces are immense, impersonal, but it reaffirms a central truth. Humanity has agency. We have a capacity for foresight, for cooperation, for innovation. Our ancestors showed that again and again. Their stories, written in submerged stone and preserved myth, are testaments to endurance. They remind us the conversation with the sea is eternal. Our task isn't to win that conversation. It's to learn how to listen, to adapt, and when necessary, to respectfully withdraw. The ruins are a warning. But they're also a guide. They show the path forward has been walked before, not in comfort but in survival. And that memory itself might be our most crucial tool. Our continental shelves are these huge, quiet landscapes. They go on for miles, sloping away from the coast before they just drop off into the deep. And for most of human history, that zone has been a blind spot. A kind of archaeological unknown. We've actually mapped the surface of Mars in more detail than our own coastlines underwater. But that's starting to change now. The new frontier isn't in a jungle or a desert. It's in the water right off our shores, and we're finally building the tools to see it. The key is technology that can listen and look without needing a diver. So you have these autonomous vehicles that glide through the dark, using sonar to paint high-resolution pictures of the seafloor. They can cover these vast, empty stretches of sand and silt, just looking for anomalies. For the straight line that doesn't belong, the perfect circle, a mound that rises too symmetrically from the plain, it's a form of remote sensing, like having a flashlight in a dark library, slowly showing you shelves of books you never knew were there. And each potential target is a question, a promise. So what could these machines find? The possibilities really pull at you. Take the Sunda Shelf. That's the big, shallow sea between Southeast Asia and Indonesia. During the last ice age, that was all dry land, a plain, a land bridge for the earliest human migrations out of Africa, heading toward Australia. The stone tools, the campfires from those first explorers, they wouldn't be on today's coast. They'd be out there on that drowned plain. Finding even one site like that would rewrite chapters of the human journey. It would give us a snapshot of our ancestors at a pivotal moment, preserved in the silt of a river valley that's gone now. Or picture the Persian Gulf. That basin was mostly dry land 20,000 years ago, a fertile valley fed by the Tigris and Euphrates and other ancient rivers. Then the seas rose and it flooded, becoming the Gulf we know. Could its floor hold the remains of early trading posts, settlements that thrived in that lush environment, forming networks long before Mesopotamia rose? These wouldn't be grand cities, they might be small outposts, wharves, storage pits, the humble beginnings of maritime commerce, now sitting under 100 feet of salt water. And then there's the most tantalizing thought, the possibility of entire cultures we don't know about, societies that developed on coastlines that are now drowned, isolated for centuries, only to be dispersed or submerged when the water rose. They left no written records for later civilizations to find, no descendants to carry their names. Their whole story exists only in the physical traces they left behind. On a seafloor we are just starting to scan. A single discovery, a unique style of pottery or a ceremonial structure unlike any other, could introduce a completely new chapter into the human story. A lost thread in the tapestry. This isn't about hunting for Atlantis, it's about filling in the map, recognizing that for tens of thousands of years, some of the most attractive land for human settlement was on these coastal plains. The very places that were most vulnerable when the climate warmed. The record of that long human experiment is down there, fragmentary, scattered, but real. Every ping of a sonar, every grid square mapped, brings us closer to understanding. The next big revelation about our past might not come from a dig in Egypt or a tomb in Peru. It might come from a robotic submersible hovering over a curious shape on a monitor, on a ship rolling on the waves. The frontier is waiting, and for the first time we have the means to explore it. That robotic submersible seeing a shape on its screen, it raises a question: who does that past belong to? The sea hides these sites, but that doesn't make them ownerless. The ethics here, underwater, it's a deep current, more complex than on land. A sunken ship is often a final resting place. A submerged village can be the ancestral home of a living community. To treat these places just as sources of data, as troves of artifacts, is to miss the point. They're not just sites, they're sacred spaces, time capsules of human experience. They demand a stewardship guided by science and by reverence. This challenge led to a framework, an international one, an UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage. It establishes a principle: in situ preservation. The first option should always be to leave the site where it is, protected on the seafloor. Excavation is a last resort. Because once you raise an artifact, its context is altered forever. The layer of silt it rested in, its position next to another object, those relationships hold immense information. Lifting something destroys that context, so the convention prioritizes non-intrusive surveys, like photogrammetry. It's a philosophy of looking without touching, learning without taking. This framework also helps nations protect their waters from the other threat: commercial treasure hunting. The lure of gold and artifacts has driven salvage for centuries. But this is looting, it's not archaeology. Treasure hunters want valuable objects, they discard everything else. They use destructive methods, dredging, explosives. They obliterate the structure of a site to get to the shiny bits, and in doing that, they erase history. They turn a layered story into a handful of disconnected trinkets. The financial gain for a few destroys knowledge for everyone. It's the opposite of stewardship. Fighting it requires vigilance, international cooperation. Treating cultural heritage not as a commodity but as a shared inheritance. The most vital ethical dimension, though, is human. For many indigenous and coastal communities, these submerged places aren't ruins. They're landmarks in cultural memory where ancestors lived, fished, are buried. Engaging with these descendant communities isn't a bureaucratic hurdle. It's the foundation. It means involving them from the start, listening to their oral histories. Those histories might hold precise locations or meanings lost to written records. It means respecting their wishes, which could be to conduct a ceremony before any work begins, or even to leave a site undisturbed as a memorial. Science gains from this partnership. The stories passed down can guide researchers, give context to what they find, and in return, archaeology can provide physical evidence, evidence that validates cultural heritage, helps communities reclaim parts of their history taken by the sea. Preserving these sunken time capsules is a moral imperative. It looks backward and forward. We're temporary custodians of a fragile record. Our responsibility is to ensure these stories aren't extracted for profit or for careless curiosity, but are treated with integrity so that future generations with better technology and deeper understanding can also learn from them. The silent cities beneath the waves hold collective memory. Their stewardship asks us to be not just discoverers but guardians, to listen to the past with patience and to protect its voice for the listeners yet to come. The Black Sea has this secret, a deep, quiet one. For a long time now there's been this idea, a radical one, about ancient floods, the Black Sea deluge hypothesis. It says about 7,600 years ago, that basin was a freshwater lake, sitting hundreds of feet below the world's oceans. Then the last ice age melted. The Mediterranean rose, and it finally broke through a natural dam at the Bosporus. What happened next was a catastrophe, hard to even picture, a roaring cascade of salt water. Pouring into that low basin for months, maybe years, the shoreline would have moved a mile each day, drowning an area like Florida. If people were living on those shores, their world just vanished. Not a slow creep, a cataclysm, and that memory, the theory goes, could have echoed across generations, becoming the heart of all those great flood stories in the region. It's a compelling story. It connects geology to myth, but is it true? The science to find out it shows how messy real discovery is and how magnificent. The first evidence came from oceanography. Back in the 90s, researchers sampled the seafloor. They found a stark transition. Below a certain depth, the mud had freshwater mollusk shells. Above that line, saltwater species. The date for that change clustered around 5600 BCE. That suggested something sudden, a dramatic shift in the sea's chemistry. Later surveys mapped the drowned landscape itself. Sonar images showed the ghost of an ancient world, river channels carved into the continental shelf. Now under hundreds of feet of water, a former coastline with beaches and sandbars, this wasn't a gentle lake, it was a vast, low plain drained by rivers. Ripe for people to settle, the geological evidence for a major change is strong, but the scale and speed, that's where the debate starts. Critics of the catastrophic model point to newer studies. They say the inflow from the Mediterranean might have been rapid but less dramatic, a surge, not a biblical deluge. The sea level difference might have been smaller. The flooding could have been something you'd notice over a lifetime, a relentless advance, not an overnight doom. This disagreement isn't a failure, it's the process. It forces a more careful look, a refinement of the question, and it shifts the burden of proof to a different kind of evidence. If people saw this, they would have left traces. So the hunt began for the most elusive prize, a human settlement on that drowned shoreline. Find one ancient village, submerged at the exact depth and date of the flood. That would change the hypothesis from a geological model into a human story. Marine archaeologists have scanned promising areas, like the shelf off Turkey. The challenges are immense, the sediments are thick, the sites, if they exist, are buried deep. It's a needle in a haystack at the bottom of a dark sea. But there are hints. Expeditions have reported sonar images, rectilinear shapes on the seafloor, at depths that would have been dry land. They've recovered worked wood. Stone tools from dredge samples, but caution is key. A shape on a sonar screen isn't a foundation. A tool in a dredge has lost its context. Definitive proof requires excavation in the deep. Painstaking work, costly, difficult, and it hasn't yielded a confirmed settlement yet. So where does that leave the Great Flood? The Black Sea teaches a nuanced lesson. Groundbreaking ideas often arrive with a splash. a dramatic story that captures the imagination, but proving them requires the slow drip of evidence. The truth is probably in the middle. The basin did flood, the salt water did rush in. It altered the ecosystem and geography dramatically. People living around the edges would have experienced it as a profound crisis. Spanning generations, their oral histories of the event passed down, woven into the myths of cultures like Mesopotamia. They could very well carry the memory of that lost shoreline. The Black Sea reminds us the most powerful stories from our past aren't simple. They're layered, like sediment on the seafloor. They hold the sudden shock of change and the slow patience of the earth, and they wait in the darkness for us to learn how to read them. The sea has this contradiction built right into it. It's the source of life where civilizations begin, and it's also what takes everything back in the end. That old duality is in the myths. Poseidon for the Greeks, he gave the fertile sea, but he also brought the earthquake. In Hindu stories, the ocean is where you find the nectar of immortality, and it's also primal chaos. It gives and it takes, and you see that symbolism in the ruins we find underwater. The same water that erased Doggerland from the map is what held Pavlopetri's streets in place for thousands of years. A tsunami might end a community in the Black Sea, but that same force buries it in deep mud and keeps its story safe. The ocean destroys, and it acts as a museum curator. It doesn't just erase history, it decides what history gets saved and how. That creates a tension, almost a poetic one. We're drawn to these places not just for the artifacts, but for the metaphor. A city underwater is like a memory suspended, a life interrupted but held in perfect stasis. It's a loss so complete it becomes a kind of preservation. There's no rebuilding on top, no one repurposes the stones. It's a moment captured that speaks to something in us about time and memory. We fight to remember, knowing everything fades. These ruins are that struggle. The world above forgot them, but the sea didn't. The water, in its indifferent way, remembered. It kept the record, so our fascination has layers. On one level, it's archaeology. What can these pottery fragments tell us about trade? On a deeper level, it's philosophical. We see in those silent streets a mirror for our own fragility, a reminder that the ground under us isn't a promise, it's a temporary arrangement. The people who lived there believed in their permanence like we do. Their sunken homes challenge that, but there's a resilience in this symbolism too. For the sea to preserve, it first had to conquer. The fact we can find these places, that we can recover even pieces of the story, means something human was inscribed indelibly. The urge to build, to create community, to leave a mark, that urge was so strong its echo outlasted the ocean's claim. The ruins aren't just evidence of destruction. They're proof of persistence. They tell us the sea may have the last word in the physical world, but it doesn't get the final word in the story. That belongs to the survivors, to the descendants, to the curious people who listen to the waves centuries later and wonder what secrets they're keeping. The water is both the end of the tale and the keeper of its beginning. The tools to write that next chapter are being forged right now. We're on the cusp of seeing these submerged landscapes not as scattered ruins, but as complete maps. Living maps, the key is technology that can look through the layers, through the silt and sand that have hidden the past for millennia. Sediment-penetrating radar works like a medical scanner for the seafloor. It doesn't just see the top surface, it sends signals deep into the mud and reveals the shapes buried beneath. A smooth, flat layer might be an old lake bed. A cluster of small, circular disturbances could be post holes, the ghost of a longhouse frame still etched in the earth. A straight line cutting across the scan might be a pathway. A road walked by people thousands of years ago. This technology transforms the seafloor from a blank canvas into an archaeological site plan, all without ever lifting a trowel. Then there's the sheer volume of data. Modern sonar surveys produce terabytes. an overwhelming flood of points and echoes. This is where artificial intelligence steps in. We can train these systems to recognize patterns, to distinguish a natural boulder from a worked stone block, to spot the geometric regularity of a foundation amid the chaos of a reef. An AI could process in hours what would take a human team years. It scans thousands of square miles of continental shelf and flags only the most promising anomalies. It becomes a tireless partner in the search, exponentially increasing our chances of finding the needle in the haystack. Perhaps the most subtle tool comes from environmental DNA. When a community lives in a place, they leave traces beyond their tools. Skin, cells, hair, the genetic material of the plants they cultivated and the animals they tended. All of it settles into the sediments. By extracting ancient DNA from core samples of seafloor mud, scientists could one day detect the invisible signature of human habitation. They could identify not just that people were there, but what their environment was like, what they farmed, even what diseases might have been present. It's a way of listening to the landscape itself, hearing the biological whispers of a community that left no stones behind. Imagine the synthesis. An autonomous underwater vehicle glides along a grid. Its sediment-penetrating radar builds a three-dimensional map of a drowned river valley. The data streams to an AI on a research ship, which highlights a dozen areas showing structured patterns. Guided to those spots, a robotic arm takes precise core samples of the mud. Back in the lab, genetic analysis of that mud reveals traces of domesticated wheat and human biomarkers. The picture that emerges is no longer a mystery. It is a documented settlement. We know where its houses stood, how its people used the land, and when they left. We have, in effect, excavated a site without ever disturbing it. This forward-looking perspective suggests our current understanding is merely a preview. The most comprehensive map of humanity's lost coastal frontiers is waiting to be drawn. The stories of those who retreated from the rising waters are still there. Inscribed in the layers, we have been reading only the first few pages. The next decade promises to reveal entire chapters, written in silt, stone, and DNA. The silent worlds beneath the waves are about to find their voice, and what they tell us will reshape the narrative of our shared past. Pavlopetri, Yonaguni, these places are underwater. They're ruins, but they're more than that. They're archives. They hold a record of a planet that changed, and that change, rising seas in the ancient world, it shaped human history. It forced people to move. It gave rise to stories, to myths. It tested how much people could endure. Every stone down there is like a page, but it's a different kind of history book. This one wasn't written by rulers. It was written by the environment itself, and you don't read it in a library. You read it with sonar. You read it by touching things in the dark with careful hands. This whole thing, it's a long conversation with the sea, and it shows a pattern. Communities have always faced this, the water coming forward, and they responded. They built the land up, they built walls to hold it back, or they made the hard choice to leave, to retreat, and those responses, they're a mirror. They reflect the dilemma we have now. Today, so these ancient whispers from the deep, they carry two messages. One is a warning. It's about the relentless power of a world that shifts, but the other is a testament. It's about human adaptability, deep, enduring adaptability. So the story isn't just about loss, it's a story about response, continuous response, memory preserved in stories people told and in the stone itself. History, it's not just in books, it's not just in the monuments on land, it's written under the waves too, in the foundation of a house that drowned. In an anchor from a ship everyone forgot. In the mud, the layers of it that still hold the pollen from a forest that's gone. These silent archives, they remind us. Our place here has always been a negotiation, with the climate, with the coast, with the sea, this patient, enduring sea.